How do you follow up a genre-defining, best-in-class experience like Resident Evil 4? With Resident Evil 5, obviously. All dad jokes aside, Resident Evil 5 had some pretty big shoes to fill when it came to the Xbox 360 and PS3 back in 2009. According to critical reception at the time, it was a fun game, but didn't quite live up to its predecessor. Over time, that perception has changed somewhat. Now Resident Evil 5 is widely considered to be one of the worst games in the series. The release of the Switch version this year has led me to re-examine Resident Evil 5 though, not just as a port, but as a game itself. As a port, Resident Evil 5 holds up remarkably well on the Switch. In 2016, Capcom released an HD version of Resident Evil 5 on Xbox One and PlayStation 4, which is what the Switch version appears to be based on. I hadn't played this version before, so I was surprised to see just how sharp everything looks. Despite being noticeably improved, the Switch version appears to run just as well as the original version. It's improved so much that it's actually hard to tell that this is a 10-year-old game. The frame rate is mostly solid, with drops occurring only occasionally when there's a lot going on at once. For the most part, however, Resident Evil 5 is incredibly competent from a technical perspective. As a game, however, Resident Evil 5 is still the same. I first played through it on the Xbox 360, and I remember enjoying it, but it wasn't one of my favorite games. I played through it over a long weekend, put it back on my shelf, and eventually gave it away. It wasn't a game I felt strongly attached to, but it wasn't one I hated either. I was just indifferent about it. Resident Evil 5 represented, at the time, a tonal shift in the series. While the rest of the series had been survival horror titles, the fifth really leaned into the action side that Resident Evil 4 started. Instead of jump scares or persistent enemies like Mr. X chasing you throughout to terrifying effect, 5 swarms you with enemies, with dozens appearing on screen at once at moments, leaving you no option but to shoot your way through. Chris Redfield from the original Resident Evil returns as 5's main protagonist. This time around, he's investigating an outbreak of Las Plagas, the insect-like parasites from Resident Evil 4, in the fictional West African city of Kijuju. He's joined by Sheva, who acts as your co-op partner. Chris heads to Kijuju to find a man named Irving, who is at the center of the outbreak. Along the way, he discovers his former partner, Jill, who is presumed dead, may be alive, setting up the rest of the game. The story is... well, it's a story. Chris's motivations make sense, but I never felt truly captivated by it. Sheva is a much more interesting character who grew up in the area and should have been the lead character in my opinion. Unfortunately, her potential is never realized thanks to the decision to relegate her to the role of Chris's sidekick. In single player, Sheva will be AI controlled, helping you dispatch infected humans and occasionally opening doors or providing cover fire. As far as AI companions go, Sheva does a pretty good job. On occasion, she'd just get hung up trying to escape a boss and get herself killed, which will instantly end your game. But more often than not, she could hold her own without another person at the controls. Co-op, however, is a huge focus for Resident Evil 5, and it's at its best when you're playing with another person. You can play split-screen co-op from a single switch, use local wireless to play with 2 switches, or hop online and play in co-op that way. I played through some sections in the game for this review in co-op with a partner, and I dislike that as much now as I did in 2009. Capcom opted for this strange split-screen setup in which the 2 views are shrunk down and offset, leaving black bars on either side of the action. It's distracting and just a weird use of screen real estate. If you want to play co-op with a friend, I'd recommend the online or local wireless options. I couldn't test local wireless because I only have 1 review copy of the game, and sharing across 2 switches won't work because I had to be logged into my account to play in the first place. While minor improvements were made in the multiplayer department, Resident Evil 5's controls have been made far better with one simple addition. You can now use motion controls to aim similar to the PS3 original's Move controller implementation, which is inexplicably absent from the Resident Evil 4 Switch port, and it's truly a game changer. The simple addition of motion-controlled aiming revitalizes Resident Evil 5 and makes it feel fresh and new. When combined with the game's laser targeting attached to every weapon, pulling off headshots is more satisfying now than ever, even if Resident Evil 5's headshot mechanic is a little bit weird and doesn't make a ton of sense. Whenever you land a headshot, you have a chance of landing a critical headshot, which will kill most enemies immediately, but in most cases you'll have to land 5 or 6 headshots to take an enemy down. You can increase any gun's critical chance by spending your money on it between chapters or after death. The in-game shop offers a lot to purchase, which is interesting but only serves to compound one of Resident Evil 5's biggest shortcomings, its inventory system. Managing your inventory in Resident Evil 5 is a chore. You can carry a grand total of 9 items per character, or 18 total if you're managing both Chris and Sheva's items. This doesn't sound too bad until you remember that ammo for each gun takes up its own inventory slot. There are 27 weapons in Resident Evil 5 and 11 different types of ammunition. Navigating your inventory in the middle of an attack is a pain. You can set items or weapons to each of the left Joy-Con's directional buttons, but to get to the other 5 items you can hold, you'll need to open up the menu and go digging. I would often find myself more frustrated trying to get a first aid spray out than I was actually trying to kill enemies. I have no idea why Capcom sought to change up Resident Evil 5's inventory system after 4 essentially nailed it. So where does this leave my opinion of Resident Evil 5? As a port, it's excellent. It looks better than the original releases, stacking up favorably against even more recent games. It has a decent frame rate, includes the PS3 version's motion controls, has local wireless co-op, and includes all the DLC. There isn't anything really to complain about. But what about Resident Evil 5 as a game? Is it really as bad as its reputation implies? No, not really. Resident Evil 5's action sequences were compelling enough to keep me playing through. The sensation of being chased by hordes of enemies was as thrilling in 2019 as it was 10 years ago, and co-op with another human player takes the game to the next level. Resident Evil 5 is one of the most unique games in the series. It's likely to remain an outlier as Capcom has shifted back toward the survival horror genre in the decade following the original release. That said, I like Resident Evil 5, and the Switch port is the definitive version of the game. It looks great and it plays better than any version available today. If you're willing to overlook a story that isn't bad but is just okay, there's a lot of fun to be had, even if it isn't all that scary. That about wraps it up for our review of Resident Evil 5 on the Nintendo Switch. As always, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to GameXplain for much more on the Resident Evil series and all other things gaming as well. Make sure to ring that notification bell to be the first to know every time we upload a new video, and I'll see you next time.